Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for part 2 of the January 2022 Q&A.
Oh, I didn't even... Yeah, that's right. It is January 22.
It is January 2022, getting the date right, getting off to a good start with the year, not stuffing up anything like that. If you missed part 1 and all the questions that we answered in there, that should have been on the channel yesterday, day before, something like that.
Previously on.
Go check out that. And we've got more questions to answer. But before we get into that, today's video is brought to you by Gigabyte and their range of laptops powered by Nvidia RTX 30 series graphics. Whether you choose an Aorus laptop for high-end gaming or an Aero laptop for gaming and creating on the go, GeForce GPUs provide the performance you need. The Aero 15 line is a favourite of mine with its gorgeous 4K OLED display, but hardcore gamers will love the fast refresh rates on offer with Aorus laptops as well. Gigabyte's laptops come with GPUs from the RTX 3060 to the beastly RTX 3080 and are available in 15 and 17-inch sizes. Click the link in the description to learn more.
All right, one here that isn't addressed to either of us, so maybe we can have a bit of a back and forth on this one, Tim. Do you think the problem with the 6500 XT was the name? I feel that if AMD released a slightly cut down 6600 XT as the 6500 XT, then released the current 6500 XT as just the 6500 or something like that, it would have been better or would have been received better. Basically, under promise and then over deliver. If you want to weigh in first, or
yeah, I mean we've seen we get this point brought up a bit when people are sort of talking about the pricing creep for tiers of cards. So when people say, "Oh, I bought a 1060 at $250, and now I'm going up to a 2060 and it's costing $300, and now we've got the 3060 at $330." People are saying, "Well, why isn't that card still a $250 card?" And they sort of complain about, it's not the class that I was expecting anymore. And I think it kind of just doesn't matter all that much. Like, I get that you want a certain product to appear in a certain class, but what it matters most is price to performance ratio, the quality of the card or whatever. And I think if they called it even something like let's say a 6300 XT, like they went really low in the stack on naming, but it was still $200, still going to cost $270 at retail, it still had all the drawbacks of that card, then it really wouldn't have made too much of a difference. Reviews still would have been negative. It still would have copped a lot of flack for being bad.
Yeah, and then they ultimately would then have to get a 64 and a 65 in there, which they probably don't want to do. So they'd be forcing themselves into a position that they don't necessarily want to fulfill. But as Tim said, the naming is somewhat irrelevant. It's really, they want to do a good job with the naming, so they build a bit of brand power around those product lines, like things that are like Core i3, Core i5, Core i7, Core i9, and so on and so forth, with all the type of brands, and it sort of lets you know what the price point is and the general performance relative to other parts. If they start messing that all up, which they're sort of doing, then it's not very consumer friendly for actually buying their products. So I suppose they want to avoid that. But for us, it doesn't change how the product is perceived by us because it's price to performance. So it potentially would have made it even worse because it still would have been $270 as the real world price.
Yeah, and you'd expect like a 6300 XT to be a $100 card.
Max.
I mean, they're selling it. So you run into, as you say, other issues where, a lower tier at the same price, the perception is that's even more expensive, a rip-off or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think it solves anything for them. I think it just creates a whole host of other problems while not actually addressing the problem they're trying to address.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think SLI/Crossfire was killed by the manufacturers in order to be able to sell higher-end cards? If we could run two 3060s in SLI, we could get the performance of a 3090, at least with good optimization, at half the price for MSRP. Well, I wouldn't have thought they killed it just to sell higher-end cards because
I don't think that changes anything there.
Because they'd want people to buy two 3090s and SLI them.
Yeah, SLI was a win-win across the product stack as far as they were concerned.
Yeah, I think the issue is simply that it was difficult.
It was difficult, and it comes back to things we've talked about earlier, like brand perception. You don't want something that in your product lineup that either cripples performance or is janky, doesn't quite work well, isn't supported well, becomes problematic. It's not good for the brand image or the user experience. So all that stuff you want to avoid. And I think it got to the point where SLI was essentially as a sort of a dead marketing ploy, if you will. It just didn't make sense. It was too difficult. Stuff that's been covered at length by reviewers.
Especially with the DirectX 12 era where, previously with DX11 games and older, the driver could do a fair bit of the dual GPU work, which is where those technologies came in. You could go into those like profile inspector things, tweak things to try and get a bit more performance and better scaling. But then with DX12, a lot of that work fell onto the developers.
It just wasn't happening.
Some games came out with a bit of multi-GPU support, but the amount of time it takes to develop that feature versus the amount of people that have 2 GPUs in their system, the effort there just isn't worth it. So I think that killed it more than the manufacturers wanting people to, instead of buying 2 3060s, buy a 3090.
I think that's the incentive thing. For Nvidia or AMD, there was always that they were incentivized to make that technology work, to sell people 2 high-end cards so they could run triple monitors or whatever. But for the game developers, it's like, no, we just care that the card works.
Yeah.
They don't want to spend tons of time and effort making 2 of them work. So it just didn't. That's why it didn't happen.
Yep.
So basically wasn't feasible, didn't make sense anymore. So that's why both companies sort of bailed on that. Okay. Do you feel that the PC gaming industry will be permanently affected after these shortages / crazy prices are behind us?
Yeah.
Like, have a lot of people bailed to console and they're not willing to come back?
I'm not sure. I still think there's enough of an interest in PC gaming. I mean, PC gaming as an industry has grown significantly.
That's what I was going to say.
So even if people fall away to consoles or whatever, I think the industry as a whole is larger than it was.
Going into it.
So I think, I guess permanently affected gives us the connotation that affected in a bad way. But I think maybe that's a good thing that how many people have come into gaming. I think one thing, I've talked about this maybe a few times in live streams and stuff, that I think will happen is that people spending so much on these GPUs is going to affect them in the way that they're not going to be as willing to do upgrades as quickly as they would have previously. Like if you spent $1,500, $2,000 on 3080s, 3070s, how likely are you to upgrade in the next couple of generations compared to if you'd bought those at $500 or $700?
I guess it's on AMD and Nvidia to incentivize them, or Intel.
Yeah, so I think there'll be maybe a bit of a lag as people decide to wait a bit longer for upgrades and that sort of thing. But again, the CPU side's picking up. So, it's, permanently affected is kind of a hard thing to gauge because, there's cycles in the industry and all that sort of thing. Like, yes, pricing on GPUs might be higher, but CPU pricing may be very good has been good. It's very competitive in that market. So I guess there's a lot of considerations. Yeah,
it depends on how long it goes on for, really. And we don't expect it'll go on forever. We think it'll improve.
Yep.
At some point in the hopefully relatively near future. I think a lot of people will, start flocking back to PC gaming and...
Yeah, especially as new games come out, like new high-end titles. I saw Crysis 4, for example, was just announced. Those sort of titles, especially as hardware accelerates further away from a PS5 and Xbox Series X, as always happens towards the middle and end of the console cycle, that's when PC gets its real boom phase. Like the end of when the PS4 was seeming like ancient technology, like it was as slow as anything, it was running on a hard drive, all that sort of thing. That's when PC gaming felt like it was in a really a real boom phase. And now that we're in sort of the earlier stage of consoles, I expect that that'll change over time as well. So.
All right, Tim, any thoughts towards the current rumours about Nvidia abandoning the ARM takeover?
Well, I can't say I'm particularly surprised about this news. It seemed like there was a lot of regulatory hurdles.
A few roadblocks.
Nvidia was not going to get past. I think basically every jurisdiction, and again, it's probably not every jurisdiction, but a lot of major jurisdictions were heavily scrutinising the deal for a number of reasons. So I think when those sort of things come out, it's not a great surprise that a company like Nvidia is going to back out of that deal. I think it's going to end up costing them over $1 billion as part of the sort of the deal doesn't go through settlement thing. So that's going to be an impact. But I think for the industry, it's probably best for ARM to be kept independent. I think because Nvidia is an ARM customer for some of their products, obviously lots of other companies are ARM customers. That just makes sense that if you're licensing that technology, you don't want to have one company potentially turn it into a monopoly and, for example, hoard particular aspects of the technology or whatever that could stagnate that industry. And of course, Nvidia, to give them their right of reply to that, they've always said that they were going to keep independent and not do stuff like that. But again, most companies don't do stuff like that. So yeah, I think it's probably best for the industry if it, like I said, if it's kept independent, companies can license that technology, use it as they see fit, and ARM can keep developing their architectures in a way that benefits all of their customers. So yeah, it might end up being something that's better for the industry, but again, I guess that won't play out for quite some time.
All right, given that in Australia, PC Keisky has 3060 selling for more than 6700 XTs, do you think AMD's market share is going to grow compared to Nvidia, considering the price and availability differences between them in the near term? I mean, potentially by a minuscule amount.
I think it's, even if pricing is good, I think a lot of that will still come down to availability. I would expect that a lot of these cards are going to be still fairly expensive and still the pricing of those cards related to the availability of them. So again, the only way that this I think could play out in the way the question is suggesting is if the AMD GPUs were available for a lot lower price, they're constantly available, and then Nvidia GPUs were expensive and sitting on store shelves and not being sold, which I don't really see happening. I'd think the Nvidia GPUs would keep falling in price as supply improves, demand, all that stuff's sorted out. So again, what is the situation going to be when we see more availability? Is AMD going to be outsupplying Nvidia? I'm not sure.
All right, why would AMD choose to exacerbate the PCIe and VRAM problems they face with the 5500 XT and then tear down their own blog post lambasting the 4GB gaming GPUs? Do you think they are just cashing in and labeling an X300 tier product as an X500, or they were perhaps too far in development to address these issues and simply choose to bury their heads in the sand?
I think the second part there about the development, being too far into the development, is certainly the case. This really feels like a card designed for laptops being repurposed for desktops.
Well, that's exactly what it is,
if they were going back and they were saying, we need now a product for desktops in a $200 market to capitalize on the current market conditions, and we're selling the 6600 at above that price, so we need something. And if the design on that GPU wasn't finalized, I think they would go back and at the very least do things like re-enable encoding, increase the PCIe bandwidth, potentially add a higher memory bandwidth as well, and add more VRAM, do all those sorts of things.
It's basically design an entirely different piece of silicon.
I think they would have designed the silicon for desktop and then repurposed it for laptops as opposed to the other way around.
So is it a cash grab? So they'd obviously designed this GPU, and they had an intended price, which were their calculations that far after they didn't read the market, or how much were they going to be selling it for in an entry-level laptop?
So I guess how long ago did they finalize an RV24 design? I guess that's really what it
wasn't going to be a $200 GPU. It wasn't going to add $200 to the cost of the laptop.
I think the most likely thing is that a product like the 6600 was supposed to be the $200 card, and then everything went up. Everything went up, and they had this opportunity, and they sort of cashed in on it with this product. But I don't think they were sitting in their design lab saying, let's deliberately cut out PCIe
for the desktop,
or cut out encoding for the desktop. I don't think that makes sense.
No, those features were meant to be handled by the APU.
I think the disappointing thing for me is sort of the narrative that AMD has come up with to justify those changes to the product, instead of just coming out and saying, hey guys, this was originally supposed to be the plan for our laptop GPUs, but in the current market, this is what we can offer in this price tier. It has got these limitations, but it was designed for this purpose. Whereas from the briefings that you had, and we talked to AMD about, some of their justifications were things like, we deliberately made the die small so that it's more affordable and more easily made for, preventing mining and all that. And, we cut down on memory bandwidth and VRAM to make it bad for mining, good for gaming. And it's like, is that just retroactively applying reasoning to the card that you'd already made? And you kind of have to think of justifications for cutting out these features. So, I think I would have appreciated a bit more transparency on that front.
Which you were never going to get.
Which I was never going to get.
All right, Tim. When it comes to buying used cards, how old a card would you be willing to buy for $200 to $300 US? I personally would feel really hesitant to buy a 5-year-old card like the GTX 970 or 1060 for $200 plus.
Yeah, I think this comes down to, again, things like how desperate are you and what you're faced with as the alternate to buying a used card. So in the current market, again, this I guess is related to the 6500 XT again. Your option is kind of getting shafted either way. If you go new, you're getting shafted on the front that the card has limited features, some, that's basically it. It has a lot of limited features,
questionable
limitations,
performance in PCI
questionable
3.0,
performance,
even 4.0.
etc. Whereas on the used front, you're getting shafted in a different area. So when we talk about an RX 580 4GB, for example, it's a better performing card with different features, for PCI 3.0 systems. It's got the encoding and stuff, but you're getting shafted on things like warranty. You're getting shafted on how long is that card going to live. I still expect that they would work just fine, but obviously that card might have been in someone's system for 5 years as opposed to 0 years. So it's kind of a trade-off there. Like, what are you willing to sacrifice? Are you willing to sacrifice features, or are you willing to sacrifice the warranty and reliability side? But even based on that, I think there are some cards that are too old, and those would be cards that I would think are going to be very quickly superseded.
Like the 970 I would avoid.
970 was one of these options, 3.5 gigabytes / 4 gigabytes of VRAM. Also, Nvidia's very slow to optimize drivers for those older architectures. That's right. If you go even older than that or around that age, you start running into how many DirectX 12 features does that card support?
I'm not even sure they're supporting Kepler anymore.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I think they've dropped driver support for it.
Yeah, so obviously on AMD side, R9 series cards, driver support, not a thing. Again, support for various different features. That's, you wouldn't want to buy a card that didn't have good DirectX 12 feature support these days.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to buy a card with such low VRAM that 1080p low settings in future games is not going to run. Which again is probably going to be the case with let's say a GTX 1060 3 gigabyte might be an issue. So those are the cards that I would avoid, but I don't see any problem buying an RX 580 4 gig, RX 570, those sort of GPUs, which they're 4 or 5 year old GPUs.
Yeah, it's a good tie. It's the cheapest GPU you can get that's reasonable. Yeah. It's going to tie you over, and it's, in my opinion, a better option to the 6500 XT, especially if you're using PCI Express 3.0.
Yeah, and again, I think with the 5 year old cards, I wouldn't be expecting cards to die at 5 years, 6 years. I don't think I've ever had a GPU die. You've had a couple?
I've not really ever had an old GPU die. I've had a couple of relatively new ones. Like I said, I think I had an RTX 2080 Ti and an RTX 2080 die.
Yep.
But I've had multiple old RX 580 and 480 cards and never had them die. A lot of them I've given to friends, kids and stuff like that for gaming. They use them every day, still working just fine. So the RX 580s seem pretty indestructible. I'm sure plenty of them have died, but I haven't come across one. I've bought quite a few used ones, and my 4 gigabyte 580 was a second-hand purchase, and it's working well.
As a reviewer, do you agree with Intel's Pat Gelsinger that AMD are now in the rear vision mirror? It was an interesting statement for a company to make, in my opinion.
Do they mean like in the sub $300 market?
I'm not sure.
Or do they mean like...
I think they mean in general?
Do they mean like Threadripper?
Yeah.
Do they mean like having more than 10 cores?
Yeah, so it's one of those statements that you probably wouldn't want to just make because it's going to come back and bite you in some way. I don't think Intel with Alder Lake are far enough ahead to be making statements
Well,
like
they've got
that.
8 P cores with 8 E cores, and it works pretty well on some productivity workloads, but that's their strike back, and then AMD will release Zen 4, and then they've got a,
Yeah, so it's like, okay, AMD are in the rear vision mirror, but Alder Lake is, for gaming, like slightly faster than Zen 3?
Slightly faster, and you could still make arguments for where you would buy AM4, which means they're not in the rear view mirror.
And productivity trades blows in some applications, depending on what you look at.
Yep.
So I think if you're saying a company's in the rear vision mirror, that would have applied when...
FX days.
FX days.
Yeah.
That's when you say AMD's in the rear vision mirror, not when you you've just overtaken them and you look back just to check that you can change lanes to get in front of them again,
and then
which is where they are at the moment.
If it's like hardware encoding, you'll get steamrolled. Code compiling, code compilation.
So I think it's it's one of those it's just one of those marketing things where just don't say stuff like that. Like just
it always comes back to bite you for sure.
Best off not.
Because if they release like the 580 3D.
Yeah.
Sorry, the 5800X 3D. Oh, I'm running on very little sleep. I was up all night last night with this damn product release. It was 1 a.m. for us, so I'm a bit cooked at this point.
And I think statements like this are kind of, I almost see it like the old Intel attitude, which let them kind of get superseded by AMD throughout the early, the Ryzen generations, where Intel was kind of stagnating slowly. AMD was like this with their performance from the FX days. If you think of your competitor as in the rear vision mirror, does that affect your incentive to develop better products for the next generation? Like, if you think your competitor's back there, then you're like, oh well, they're back there. We don't need to. Our next generation doesn't need to be as good as it had to be. It's obviously one of those
BS, arrogant marketing comments that they make. But both companies do it.
Yes.
But anyway, it's probably not something you need to pay too much attention to.
Yep.
Okay. If the 5800X 3D, which is what I was trying to say before, but in my sleepy state wasn't able to get it out easily, turns out to be really as fast as AMD advertised, will you switch from the 5950X to the 5800X 3D for GPU tests? Or is it even worth switching since there won't be any exciting GPU launches until the end of the year, where it happens that new CPU platforms would be launched around that time too? No. Basically, the 5950X really isn't that CPU limited, and for the high-end cards that you're testing at 1440p and 4K, for the most part, you will be GPU limited there. So that'd be something we would update for the next generation of GPUs with the next generation of CPUs. So at least for the foreseeable, we'll stick with the 5950X because it's not worth updating all of that data for a couple of flagship GPUs that might affect that don't exist yet.
Yes, you'd wait until like a Zen 4 or what's the next Intel platform? Raptor Lake. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, probably the best way. Next question, do you think budget VA panels will ever become as fast as IPS/TN, like say Samsung G7, or will they always be a slower darkroom alternative? Well, I think we've seen with the Samsung Odyssey G7 that they can be fast. It's just a matter of that performance eventually coming down to the budget tier. And currently a lot of those budget VA panels are older technology. Like they're not releasing a new panel that's still slow. They're just still using the old slow panels. So I think it's definitely possible. Again, it's, how long are we talking in terms of getting those budget panels? I'm not sure. Are they going to artificially restrict them to the high end for now? I'm not sure, but I think it's definitely possible. So I'm hoping something like that happens. All right, and that wraps us up for our January Q&A series, 2 parts this month. We also had our little discussion of some of the, post-launch things for the 3050 and the 6500 XT. A couple of questions that you all answered that we sort of covered there as well. So if you're interested, that's something else to watch on the channel. And as always, if you want to support the channel directly in our independent testing, we do have links in the description below to Patreon and Floatplane. You'll get access to things like Steve's Fortnite videos, or we're not supposed to talk about that stuff, just the Discord community
don't talk about that.
behind the scenes videos, which I guess is Steve's gameplay and all sorts of other stuff.
Why do I let you do these things? Stop talking. You're only here to answer questions.
Are you embarrassed about your Fortnite game? I thought you're pretty good.
It's fine.
You're pretty good.
You
got some headshots in there.
Moving along.
So yeah, fun stuff in there. If you're 20% club, you've got to the end of this video, and we appreciate your support and everything. So I guess that just about does it. I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve.
We'll see you in the next one.